So welcome back, grade 10s. Before the lunch break, we were looking at capitalism as it applies to globalization and the Industrial Revolution. So the overlap between capitalism and the Industrial Revolution hopefully seems clear to you in the sense that if capitalism is a system that is meant to allow individuals an opportunity for social mobility, that if they're able to adapt and be innovative, then they'll be rewarded. It's a system based on competition instead of cooperation, self-interest instead of collective interest. Then how does that fit with the Industrial Revolution? Well, those factory owners are capitalists. A lot of people call them, they're industrialists by occupation. They're factory owners by occupation, but many people call them capitalists. So often the term capitalist is used to describe a factory owner during the Industrial Revolution, because they seem to be implementing the ideology of capitalism to shape their lives. So they are implementing the idea of self-interest, being innovative, of taking a risk, but providing some kind of good or service. If it's a factory, it's probably a good that is in demand in the free market. So this was a response of a paradigm shift, meaning that it hadn't always been that way. That if we look back to feudalism, there was a time of collectivism. And collectivism, we talked about how you may, instead of having a personal identity, you may identify as a member of a village. And instead of having personal goals, you may have goals to elevate your village, to maintain your village, to honor and to continue the traditions of your village. So what we see with capitalism is it's a paradigm shift, but when you have a paradigm shift, not everybody's going to follow along. So we were going in this direction, everything was collectivist, let's work for the we, and then capitalism's like, no, you know what, instead of cooperating, let's compete, let's work for the me. But not everybody was happy about that shift. One thing that capitalism did was it exposed that not everyone could compete in a free market and have the same results. That if left to their own self-interest, their own invisible hand, some may thrive, like Andrew Carnegie, who went from a poor immigrant to one of the richest Americans in history, but others may live in poverty because they don't have a niche. Their niche is that they are one of millions of laborers. They don't have skill, they don't have money to, or innovation or ideas to invest into the market. So some people looked at the gap that was growing between the rich and poor and said, no, this is not ideal. This is not a cornerstone for society, because now we have inequality. So now we're going to look at some responses to capitalism, responses to the Industrial Revolution. We're going to look at socialism, Owenism, and Marxism. Yesterday we already looked at Owenism. Yesterday we talked about Owen. So Robert Owen, you may remember, was an industrialist. He owned a factory, and he created a factory town called New Lanark. And you may remember that his town was different than other towns. And that's why New Lanark in Scotland is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. Because he, in his factory, in the absence of a government that was caring for the people, he became that de facto government. He ended up providing the things that we often associate with government today. So there's no government providing healthcare. So he provided healthcare for his workers and their families. There's no government regulating the working conditions. So there's no government legislation that protected children. There's no government legislation that established what the day should be, how many hours in a workday. No government legislation really defining what a minimal or an acceptable wage was. So in absence of government, Robert Owen became that government. He was de facto government. He said, you know what? I'm going to create my own legislation. I'm going to not hire children because they're not going to need to be hired, because I'm going to pay their parents more than what would be a market value. I'm going to provide education for my kids. They should be working, not earning. so the children of my workers will be able to go to school. I'm going to provide leisure opportunities for everyone in New Lanark. We'll have parks. But at the same time that he's providing these things, like making sure that they have a livable wage and paid vacations and things like this, that other industrialists weren't doing. So he's very enlightened. He also had some requests of his workers. So one would be no public drunkenness, because he was trying to create a utopia, an ideal society in his factory city of New Lanark. So we looked at Robert Owen yesterday as an example of someone that rejects some of those values and principles of the ideology of capitalism. Capitalism's meant to be based on self-interest. And rather than being a selfish capitalist, he ended up taking some of his profit and returning it back to the workers. He didn't have to do that, but he paid his workers more than they would be receiving in other factories. He didn't have to provide education for their children or leisure for their children and the families of the workers. So it's an example of someone actually implementing socialism. And socialism would be an ideology that instead of having that paradigm shift from we to me, maybe we should be still doing that we stuff. Maybe I have a responsibility to the collective. Maybe we should cooperate, not compete. So, we're going to look at Owenism and socialism and Marxism today. And all three you should see as responses to the Industrial Revolution, but they're also all three responses to capitalism, because they're going to see a problem in capitalism and try to solve that problem. We're going to start with socialism, because Owen, and in his experiment in New Lanark, it's a form of socialism. And Marxism is a form of socialism. Socialism is an umbrella that all of these things fit under, so that's why we'll start here. So what is socialism?
What do Scandinavia, Bernie Sanders, and the Soviet Union have in common? Well, arguably the most misused theory of all time, socialism. The word is thrown around in popular culture and political discourse as both a pejorative and a compliment. But how can the same system be behind both the Nazi Party and Finland's world-class education system? What exactly is socialism? Well, in its most simple form, socialism is when a population collectively owns and controls the means of production.
So that's the first distinguishing feature between socialism and capitalism. Is in capitalism, wealth is privately owned, and in socialism, wealth is collectively owned. That's an easy distinguishing factor. So we have some collectively owned wealth in Canada, and we have some privately owned wealth in Canada. We have some collectively owned wealth here in Wetaskiwin, and we have some privately owned wealth here in Wetaskiwin. What's an example of collective wealth that not one person or one family, but the entire community shares in that wealth? What's an example of that here in Wetaskiwin? Something that's collectively owned. Everybody owns it. Yes?
I don't know, water?
Maybe our water? Okay? So at home, you're going to have a utility bill. So we are paying for our water and our water consumption at a family or a residence basis. But we do collectively own the water which rains from the sky, right? Unlike Cochabamba in Bolivia. So if you had a visitor came to Wetaskiwin and they're like, oh man, this city's amazing. Can you show me something that is collectively owned, that is publicly owned? What's an example? What's public property in town? It's not your house. Your house is owned by someone. Not your backyard, that's your private backyard, yes?
Just a guess, but like the pool?
So maybe the pool, if the city owns it, That might be getting close to an example. Yeah?
A park.
A park. So if you're going to take them to a park in town, which park do you take them to? What's your Wetaskiwin Park?
Probably by the lake park.
Probably by the lake park. That's public property. It's not private property. Tonight, Mr. McBride can't go and put a fence around a part of By Lake Park and say, you know what, this is my property now. You have to pay to walk through it. I've annexed it. It's mine. Well, it's public property. All people can equally access it. That's publicly shared wealth. We have public high schools. We have public health care. This is public stuff in Wetaskiwin. We also have private stuff in Wetaskiwin. Again, Moe's Barbershop. That's a company that's privately owned. It's not owned by all of us. When profit is made at Moe's, I don't get a piece of the action as a citizen of Wetaskiwin because I don't own Moe's Barbershop. But I do have partial ownership of public space like the park. So, main difference between capitalism and socialism. In socialism, things are publicly owned. So if something is publicly owned, and if that something that is publicly owned creates wealth, then everyone shares in the wealth. So if we have a publicly owned factory, and the factory made $1 billion last year, then we all share in that $1 billion. That's the essence of socialism. We all share in the wealth.
And distributes the end result proportionally. In practice, however, control is usually delegated to the state, while the distribution usually comes in the form of underlying social welfare.
And we have social welfare in Canada, but it's not the only thing we have. So we have a mixed system of capitalism and socialism.
To satisfy everyone's basic needs like housing, education, and healthcare. The end-all purpose is to guarantee a level playing field for all members in a society, thereby removing class distinctions based on ownership. For example, in the US's capitalist society, high-quality education is expensive, meaning that those who can afford it are generally given better opportunities. Those who can't are forced to compete at a material disadvantage.
So there's not an equality of opportunity if university is cost prohibitive, if it's prohibited by its cost to some families. If it's going to cost $100,000 a year to go to Harvard, only the elite are going to Harvard. So it perpetuates elitism. So in other places like Germany, universities are free for all, even for Canadians. You want to go to a German university, if you meet the requirements to get in, it'll be free for you, because they want to see everyone share in that same opportunity to elevate themselves. So there's different values here. In the United States, it's more self-interest. If you want to go to university, then maybe save up some money, or maybe work really hard at school so you can get a scholarship. In Germany, they're saying, as a society, we'll pay for your university, because it's going to benefit the group if you go.
This leads to class inequality, not on the basis of talent or ability, but on generational wealth. By comparison, in countries like Finland, where high-quality education is free, everyone is given the same opportunity to succeed or fail, regardless of their financial status. If that sounds a bit idealistic, that's because it's supposed to. Early socialism was predicated on the idea that if we could eliminate classes and have true societal equality, it would be a utopia. In fact, the earliest modern form of socialism was called Utopian Socialism. It's important to note that there are no 100% socialist countries, but rather different socioeconomic systems with socialist undertones. Even the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which literally has the word socialist in the name, has been called a far cry from real socialism.
So to try to think about this, I think about vanilla ice cream. You know, there's so many different flavors of vanilla ice cream, but they're all vanilla ice cream. So we see the word socialism, but there's different flavors of socialism. Maoism's different than Leninism, which is different than Stalinism, which is different than the National Socialism under Hitler, which is different than Scandinavian socialism in Denmark and Norway and Sweden and Finland. which is different than Castroism, which is different than what Bernie Sanders wants to bring to America and the NDP want to bring to Canada. So socialism is like vanilla. It comes in many flavors. All has some similar stuff. One vanilla taste should be similar to something else, but it's not the same. Some vanilla ice cream is quite disgusting. And some vanilla ice cream might be just vanilla by name. And you eat it and you're like, man, that didn't taste like vanilla at all. So some people might look at the USSR and say, that's not true socialism. That's not even true Marxism. There's a perversion. There's something that's been added that's taken away from what was the original intention. You know, maybe they added a little lemon to the mix. And instead of tasting the vanilla, you taste lemon ice cream. And that wasn't meant to be the purpose.
The same is true of Nordic countries, which employ socialist programs combined with a capitalist economy. But why are the Nordic countries doing so well, while Russia is still recovering? Well, like any political system, socialism has a countless number of variations. The two most dominant are social democracy, as practiced by Sweden and Bernie Sanders, and the Marxism-Leninism form of socialism used by the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba. A social democracy generally prioritizes improving quality of life through equal rights and opportunities, bolstered by a state-run welfare system and on top of a capitalist economy. On the other hand, Marxism-Leninism prioritizes the infallibility of its dictatorship government. The rationale is that any benefit to the state would also be a benefit for the people. However,
and he's about to mention that the infallibility of the government is a dangerous cornerstone. Even looking at our own governments in Canada, we can see that there's many controversies that stain them. That the USSR was not infallible, that the government may make the wrong decisions. And under leaders like Lenin and Stalin, millions will perish because of the decisions of their government. So one of the dangerous ideas of Marxism is the dictatorship of the proletariat. We're going to put our faith in the government to command the economy to benefit all, but the government may say, you know what, we're going to starve to death 6 million Ukrainians so we can build tanks, because we want guns over butter. Tanks are cool, but those 6 million people probably would like to be alive.
in practice, this has meant that the ruling party can massively depreciate the population's standard of living for the good of the state. Although both strive for similar utopian socialist goals, the way they approach them is very different. These examples show that socialism, along with its logical extreme, communism, may be backed by rational theory, but requires rational practice to go along with it. Socialist democracies are the happiest countries in the world. Other socialist-leaning countries, like China and Cuba, suffer from terrible human rights abuses like modern slavery and censorship. Maybe the best takeaway is not to trust anyone using the word socialism to describe radically different political theories. Just because salad is in the name doesn't make fruit salad, potato salad, and Caesar salad the same thing. If you'd like to learn...
Man, I guess his salad thing's better than my vanilla ice cream thing. So he mentions that Marxism is a different version of socialism, and we're going to find out today that the main difference is that Marxists will believe that violence is an acceptable means to an end, and in fact the only means to an end. So the socialists believe that we can create a utopian paradise maybe through democracy, but the Marxists believe that the workers will have to unite and fight a civil war against the interests of the bourgeoisie in order to create a workers' paradise. So the main difference between a socialist and a Marxist, Marxism is a subset of socialism. So they are socialist, Marxists are, but they just have a different means to an end. And they believe violence is that means. So next up we'll review Owen, and then we'll look at Marxism. And then we should be done this half of the course. It's a nice little cartoon. It's like 2 minutes long. I've already talked lots about Owen, so I'm just going to be quiet for the next 2 minutes.
1799. The New Lanark Mills near Glasgow.
Robert Owen was a factory owner in Victorian Scotland. He owned the New Lanark cotton mills on the River Clyde. And New Lanark, he decided to improve the quality of his workers' lives. Like the rest of Britain, making cotton was a huge industry in Scotland, and Owen thought that factory workers should have decent conditions. However, most other factory owners didn't share his opinion. Owen lived during the Industrial Revolution. This was a time when, across Europe and the Americas, new machines helped big businesses make more products like cotton. But Owen was appalled by the working conditions he witnessed.
How old are those children? Surely they are too young to do this kind of work.
Owen wrote a book about how much he disagreed with child labour and how badly the working classes were treated in Britain.
It is normal for parents to send their children to work at 7 years old, from 6 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock at night. Children don't have time to relax. If we do nothing, the country will soon be plunged into a terrible state of danger.
Owen created a factory, or model village, built with his workers' needs in mind. He built a school where children learned music and studied nature, and provided a shop where quality goods could be bought at a fair price. New Lanark even had the world's first infant school. And most importantly of all, workers no longer had to spend incredibly long hours in the factory. Visitors came from all over the world to see the amazing work Owen was doing at New Lanark. And during the rest of the Victorian era, the idea that everyone had the right to better working conditions grew to become accepted as the law.
All right, so hopefully when you hear Robert Owen's name next, you'll remember something. So you can see how Owen has an ideology, beliefs and values, a way to see the world, and his ideology is a response to the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is connected to globalization. So social studies doesn't have to be hard if you can understand each chunk as we go. So the last chunk of this unit, the last chunk of the first half of the year is Marxism. So again, Karl Marx was a socialist, but by the 1850s, he was beginning to think that, you know what, this utopia is not going to happen. Because the interests of the bourgeoisie will always hold the interests of the proletariat back. So he comes up with his idea that the workers will eventually have an epiphany, an awakening, a moment when they realize they were being exploited, a moment when they realize that the strong are doing to them what they want and the weak are suffering, a moment when he realizes that the workers can become the strong and will become the strong when they have the epiphany that they have the numbers. So to Karl Marx, he believed that there would be an awakening, an epiphany. The workers would awaken to the reality that they're being oppressed. And when they wake up to that reality, they're going to be violent. They're going to be angry about what's happened to them, that they've been robbed of their value. And they'll use weapons to take over the factory. When they take over 1 or 2 factories, and those factories fall, it's going to inspire workers at other factories to do the same. Once you have this national wave of factory conflict, it's going to end up creating a civil war because the owners of the factories, they don't want to lose their property. But Karl Marx believed that the workers would win the civil war because they control the means of production. They control the factories. But once the workers win the civil war, Karl Marx thought that they're going to have to change the hearts and minds of all the people. So in order to change the hearts and minds of the people and to redistribute wealth, they're going to need to create a dictatorship of the proletariat, a dictatorship of the workers. But he hoped that that would be temporary, not generations. He hoped that the dictatorship of the proletariat could take an economy based on competition and self-interest and create an economy based on cooperation and collective interest. He was hoping to create a paradigm shift back in the hearts and minds of the people, back towards collectivism. And once the paradigm shift was created, then the state could wither away. And his ideal goal was that everyone would work as hard as they can. And everyone would get everything that they need. So he had a maxim, a saying, a motto. And Karl Marx's maxim was, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So we're all going to work as hard as our ability is. So from each according to his ability, we're going to work as hard as we can. To each according to his need. So the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Marx is saying, no, they don't have to suffer. The weak don't have to suffer. They're going to have an epiphany. They're going to wake up and realize, hey, wait, we can become the strong if we unite. Unlike the unionists that we looked at yesterday that thought through collective bargaining they can have a better life, Marxists believe that it's going to have to result from violence. We'll have to have a revolution. But in the end, it'll be worth it because we'll create a utopia, a paradise on earth. Rather than waiting for paradise in the afterlife, heaven, we'll create heaven on earth, a utopia, here, now. The kingdom is now. And how can we live in the kingdom if we work as hard as we can, but we don't work for us. We don't work for ourselves, we work for all of us. From each according to his ability. I'm going to work as hard as I can every day. And everybody's going to get everything they want. The problem is it breaks down. Because if you're guaranteed to get everything you want, are you going to work as hard as you have to every day? Most people don't. If all my needs are going to be taken care of, then maybe I don't work as hard. Or maybe I have an easier job. So maybe I do a job in society where I'm not contributing as much as I could, but I still get everything I want, so I'm happy. So the problem with communism is it ends up lacking motivation. So in the USSR, recognizing that the people lack motivation, the state had to force them to be motivated by fear and terror. And now instead of creating a utopia, you create a dystopia. Because now the people are living in tyranny. So, we're going to watch the political theory 9-minute video, and then we'll have like 5 minutes left in class. And that'll be enough time just to absorb some of the stuff from today. And homework for the weekend is plentiful, right? But one thing I need you to do is to come to class on Monday prepared with questions for the multiple choice. I'll have Chromebooks booked on Monday, so you can continue to work planning your essay, and you can continue to review your A1. Monday, by design, is a review day. But it needs to be a day with purpose. Not just going to be like, hey, let's listen to the Beatles sing yesterday. No, we'll do that today. All right. Let's see Marxism.
Most people agree that we need to improve our economic system somehow. Yet they're also often keen to dismiss the ideas of capitalism's most famous and ambitious critic, Karl Marx. This isn't very surprising. In practice, his political and economic ideas have been used to design disastrously planned economies and nasty dictatorships. Nevertheless, we shouldn't reject Marx too quickly. We ought to see him as a guide whose diagnosis of capitalism's ills helps us to navigate towards a more promising future. Capitalism is going to have to be reformed, and Marx's analyses are going to be part of any answer. Marx was born in 1818 in Trier in Germany. Soon he became involved with the Communist Party, a tiny group of intellectuals advocating for the overthrow of the class system and the abolition of private property. He worked as a journalist and had to flee Germany, eventually settling in London. Marx wrote an enormous number of books and articles, sometimes with his friend Friedrich Engels. Mostly, Marx wrote about capitalism, the type of economy that dominates the Western world. It was, in his day, still getting going, and Marx was one of its most intelligent and perceptive critics. These were some of the problems he identified with it. Modern work is alienated. One of Marx's greatest insights is that work can be one of the sources of our greatest joys. But in order to be fulfilled at work, Marx wrote that workers need to see themselves in the objects they have created. Think of the person who built this chair. It's straightforward, strong, honest, and elegant. It's an example of how, at its best, labour offers us a chance to externalise what's good inside us. But this is increasingly rare in the modern world. Part of the problem is that modern work is incredibly specialised. Specialised jobs make the modern economy highly efficient, but they also mean that it's seldom possible for any one worker to derive a sense of the genuine contribution they might be making to the real needs of humanity. Marx argued that modern work leads to alienation, Entfremdung. In other words, a feeling of disconnection between what you do all day and who you feel you really are and what you think you'd ideally be able to contribute to existence. Modern work is insecure. Capitalism makes the human being utterly expendable, just one factor among others in the forces of production, and one that can ruthlessly be let go the minute that costs rise or savings can be made through technology. And yet, as Marx knew deep inside each of us, we don't want to be arbitrarily let go. We're terrified of being abandoned. Communism isn't just an economic theory. Understood emotionally, it expresses a deep-seated longing that we always have a place in the world's heart, that we will not be cast out. Workers get paid little, while capitalists get rich. This is perhaps the most obvious qualm that Marx had with capitalism. In particular, he believed that capitalists shrink the wages of the labourers as much as possible in order to skim off a wide profit margin. He called this primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Akkumulation. Whereas capitalists see profit as a reward for ingenuity and technological talent, Marx was far more damning. Profit is simply theft, and what you're stealing is the talent and hard work of your workforce. However much one dresses up the fundamentals, Marx insists that at its crudest, capitalism means paying a worker one price for doing something and then selling it to somebody else at a much higher price. Profit is the fancy term for exploitation. Capitalism is very unstable. Marx proposed that capitalist systems are characterized by a series of crises. Every crisis is dressed up by capitalists as being somehow freakish and rare and soon to be the last one. Far from it, argued Marx. Crises are endemic to capitalism, and they're caused by something rather odd. The fact that we're able to produce too much, far more than anyone needs to consume. Capitalist crises are crises of abundance, rather than, as in the past, crises of shortage. Our factories and systems are so efficient, we could give everyone on this planet a car, a house, access to a decent school and a hospital. And that's what so enraged Marx, but also made him so hopeful too. Few of us actually need to work, because the modern economy is so productive. But rather than seeing this need not to work as the freedom it is, we complain about it masochistically and describe it by a pejorative word, unemployment. We should call it freedom. There's so much unemployment for a good and deeply admirable reason, because we're so good at making things efficiently. We're not all needed at the coalface. But in that case, we should, thought Marx, make leisure admirable. We should redistribute the wealth of the massive corporations that make so much surplus money and give it to everyone. This is, in its own way, as beautiful a dream as Jesus' promise of heaven, but a good deal more realistic sounding. Capitalism is bad for capitalists. Marx didn't think that capitalists were evil. For example, he was acutely aware of the sorrows and secret agonies that lay behind bourgeois marriage. Marx argued that marriage was actually an extension of business, and that the bourgeois family was fraught with tension, oppression, and resentment, with people staying together not for love, but for financial reasons. Marx believed that the capitalist system forces everyone to put economic interests at the heart of their lives, so that they can no longer know deep, honest relationships. He called this psychological tendency commodity fetishism, Warenfetischismus, because it makes us value things that have no objective value. He wanted people to be freed from financial constraint, so that they could, at last, start to make sensible, healthy choices in their relationships. The 20th century feminist answer to the oppression of women has been to argue that women should simply be able to go out to work. But Marx's answer was more subtle. This feminist insistence merely perpetuates human slavery. The point isn't that women should imitate the sufferings of their male colleagues. It's that men and women should have the permanent option to enjoy leisure. Why don't we all think a bit more like Marx? An important aspect of Marx's work is that he proposes that there's an insidious, subtle way in which the economic system colours the sort of ideas that we end up having. The economy generates what Marx termed an ideology. A capitalist society is one where most people, rich and poor, believe all sorts of things that are really just value judgments that relate back to the economic system. For example, that a person who doesn't work is worthless, that leisure beyond a few weeks a year is sinful, that more belongings will make us happier, and that worthwhile things and people will invariably make money. In short, one of the biggest evils of capitalism is not that there are corrupt people at the top, this is true in any human hierarchy, but that capitalist ideas teach all of us to be anxious, competitive, conformist, and politically complacent. Marx didn't only outline what was wrong with capitalism, we also get glimpses of what Marx wanted the ideal utopian future to be like. In his Communist Manifesto, he describes a world without private property or inherited wealth, with a steeply graduated income tax, centralized control of the banking, communication and transport industries, and free public education. Marx also expected that communist society would allow people to develop lots of different sides of their natures. In communist society, it's possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. After Marx moved to London, he was supported by his friend and intellectual partner Friedrich Engels, a wealthy man whose father owned a cotton plant in Manchester. Engels covered Marx's debts and made sure his works were published. Capitalism paid for communism. The two men even wrote each other adoring poetry. Marx was not a well-regarded or popular intellectual in his day. Respectable, conventional people of Marx's day would have laughed at the idea that his ideas could remake the world. Yet, just a few decades later, they did. His writings became the keystone for some of the most important ideological movements of the 20th century. But Marx was like a brilliant doctor in the early days of medicine. He could recognize the nature of the disease, although he had no idea how to go about curing it. At this point in history, we should all be Marxists, in the sense of agreeing with his diagnosis of our troubles. But we need to go out and find the cures that really will work. As Marx himself declared, and we deeply agree, philosophers until now have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.
All right, let's listen to yesterday. I'll come by with a